Anna, I need to confess something a little embarrassing today. My phone has 12 English podcasts saved, and I've listened to the first episode of almost every single one.
Only the first episode? That sounds oddly specific.
It's very specific because it's very true. I get excited. I listen once, and then a new podcast shows up. It steals my attention completely.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna.
And I'm Max, proud owner of a podcast graveyard.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of our English podcast. Today, we're talking about something Max and I have actually discussed before.
We have. Remember last episode when we talked about why people are really learning English?
I remember perfectly. You told me your real reason was connecting with your team at work, especially your English-speaking colleagues and clients.
Exactly. And I meant every word. But having a strong reason and actually building a habit are two very different things.
That's a really honest thing to admit. So tell me what actually happens when you try to practice.
Okay, here's a typical week. On Monday, I find a new podcast about business English. I love the host's voice, so I listen to 2 episodes in a row.
A strong start.
A very strong start. Then, on Wednesday, the topic feels a bit repetitive. So I open YouTube and find a completely different channel about everyday conversations.
And what happens to the first podcast?
It just sits there, forgotten. By Friday, I've opened a 3rd channel. Someone in a comment section recommended it as the best one ever.
So by the end of the week, you've started 3 different things, and you've finished none of them.
When you say it like that, it sounds a lot worse. It doesn't feel that bad in the moment.
I'm not judging you, Max. Honestly, this happens to so many learners. It even happens to native speakers trying to learn a new skill.
That's a little comforting, actually.
There's even a name for what you're describing. We can call it shiny object syndrome. It means chasing every new, exciting thing before something has a real chance to work.
So it's not just me being lazy or unfocused.
Not at all. Your brain simply loves anything new. A new podcast feels fresh and exciting, while the old one starts to feel boring.
Even if the old one was actually helping me.
Exactly. And that's the tricky part. The podcast didn't stop working. It just stopped feeling new.
I never thought about it that way before. So, excitement and real progress are actually 2 different things.
They really are, and it's incredibly easy to confuse them. I see the same pattern in my students all the time.
Really? Even people who are naturally disciplined?
Even them. One student told me she owned 5 different grammar books. She had only finished the first 3 chapters of each one.
That sounds painfully familiar.
And here's the funny part. Every single book was a good book. None of them were actually bad choices.
So the problem wasn't the books at all.
Not even close. The problem was that she kept restarting instead of continuing. She was always on chapter 1, forever.
So why does that keep happening, again and again?
It happens because starting feels productive. Choosing a new resource gives you a little rush of motivation. And that happens even before you've learned anything.
But wait, I want to push back a little. What if a podcast really isn't good for me? Should I force myself to keep listening forever?
Of course not. If something truly doesn't match your level or your goals, you should absolutely change it.
Okay, that's a relief.
But first, ask yourself an honest question. Did I actually give this a fair chance? One confusing episode is not a fair chance.
How long is a fair chance then?
A week or two usually is. Enough time to get used to the voice, the speed, and the topics.
So switching after one confusing episode is probably me running from something uncomfortable.
Probably, yes. But switching after 2 honest weeks is different. If it clearly isn't working by then, that's a real decision, not an emotional one.
One is emotional, and the other is intentional.
I love that you said it that way. That's exactly the difference.
So, what actually happens if I keep chasing shiny new things like this? Besides having a graveyard of podcasts, obviously.
You become someone who's very good at starting things, but you're not very good at finishing them.
I get excited about choosing, downloading, and planning. The actual listening barely happens.
That does sound familiar, doesn't it? And there's a second problem, too. Something called momentum.
Momentum? Like keeping the movement going?
Exactly that. Stay with something for several days in a row and your ear adjusts. Understanding gets easier every single time you listen.
But if I keep restarting, I'm always beginning again.
Right. And starting cold, again and again, is exhausting. It also makes you feel busy with English, but never actually improving.
Okay, I need real help here. What do I actually do the next time a shiny new podcast appears?
I have 3 simple ideas for you. None of them involve deleting your podcast app in frustration.
Good, because I was slightly worried about that.
First, when something new catches your attention, don't switch immediately. Just write down the name somewhere and come back to it later.
So I'm not ignoring the idea completely. I'm just protecting today's practice first.
Exactly that. Second, take a short break before you start. Have some tea, some coffee. Just relax for a minute.
So I'm not jumping straight from a busy day into English practice.
Right. If your mind is still racing, everything feels harder. English feels harder to understand, too.
Okay, park the idea. Take a short break. What's the third one?
Precisely. And third, finish one small thing completely. Not a whole podcast series, just one episode. Not a huge speaking routine, just one voice note or 5 sentences you actually remember.
That sounds almost too small to count as real progress.
That's exactly the point. Small enough that you can't find an excuse to skip it, but big enough to actually feel like progress afterward.
So the size itself is part of the trick.
Exactly. It's a bit like what we said last time about the marathon. One morning run isn't the marathon itself.
But without those morning runs, there's no marathon at all.
Precisely. One finished podcast episode isn't fluent English either, but without it, fluent English never really happens.
I like that. Small steps that actually add up somewhere.
Right. Most learners think progress needs to feel huge and dramatic to count. It really doesn't. A small finish instead of a big, ambitious plan you'll abandon in 2 days. Every small finish teaches your brain that you can actually complete something.
And that feeling builds real momentum over time.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but it genuinely changes how your brain responds to English practice.
Write it down, take a quiet moment, finish one small thing. I think I can actually try that.
I believe you can too. And maybe the real question isn't which new podcast you need next.
Maybe it's whether I've stayed with the one I already have, long enough to actually notice it's working.
Now you're starting to sound like the teacher here.
Don't get used to it. This is a rare moment.
All right, before we say goodbye, dear viewers, we actually have a question for you.
What topic would you like to hear us cover in a future episode? Write it in the comments below.
We genuinely read every single one, and we love your ideas. And speaking of upcoming topics, our next episode is already decided.
And it's a fun one, trust me. Next time, we're talking about insects in summer. All the buzzing, jumping creatures that show up every year.
It's going to be a lighter, funnier conversation after today's slightly more serious topic.
If this episode helped you understand your own learning habits, please like this video. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Thanks so much for listening today. And remember, one small finished thing is worth more than 10 forgotten plans.
So tonight, pick just one podcast episode. Not 3, not 5, just one.
Listen to it fully, all the way to the end. That's the whole challenge for today.
See you in the next episode, everyone.
Bye for now.